Greetings. Welcome to CACOR Live. I have the pleasure of introducing Ralph Martin. Ralph grew up on his family farm in Wellandstein, Ontario. After earning a PhD in plant science from McGill University in 1990, he taught at the Nova Scotia Agriculture College, where I met him in 2010 on a talk about living on Earth as if we want to stay. Ralph has actively promoted energy conservation, soil health, and quality food. He founded the Organic Agriculture Centre of Canada. Since retiring from teaching at the University of Guelph, he has published a book, Food Security, From Excess to Enough. He will talk to us today about various future possibilities for humanity and Earth. Professor Martin, the floor is yours.
And it's a real pleasure for me to be talking to you folks again at CACOR. I know you're a very alert audience, so I'll be prepared for your questions. I just want to note that before I started, there were some kids playing road hockey outside my window. So if you hear cheers, it's probably not about my talk. It's probably about a goal they scored. And I want to point out that my contact information is here and my website. If you want to get in touch with me, please feel free. And my book title is there. And in my slides, you'll see in red font a chapter number. And that means that I've talked more about that topic in the book if you are interested. Now, I'd like to go into Earth's story in 1 year. So 4.5 billion years ago, or January 1st, Earth forms. By June, we have oxygen and ozone, dinosaurs by December 19th, and then they go extinct Christmas Day in the morning, and in the afternoon, when we usually have Christmas dinner, the Cenozoic started. And then 200,000 years ago, or 23 minutes before midnight, Homo sapiens showed up. 10,000 years ago was the beginning of the Holocene, and the Holocene was unusually benign for the types of things we do in agriculture. And 100 years ago, with the beginning of modern agriculture, that was just 0.7 seconds before midnight. And I just want to go through this time acknowledgement to say that modern agriculture and how we've been interacting with the earth is not at all normal. Now, for over 90% of our existence, humans lived in egalitarian societies. And then modern inequality arose and spread with the development of agriculture. And for me, as an Aggie, that hurts. We've contributed a lot to inequality. And there was a recent article by Robert Reich in The Guardian that oligarchs are exposed and defiant. I just want to mention that I have quite a few hot links here, and they will also be in the PDF version of this talk. So you'll be able to go and check out the various links. Some are articles, some are papers from journals and so on. Smallholder farms produce 80% of the world's food supply with only 12% of the arable land. I want you to remember this because when a little bit later in the talk, this will become more relevant. 1% of the world's farms control 70% of the world's farmlands, and Bill Gates is the biggest private owner of farmland in the US. And I dare say he doesn't know much about farming, but he does own a lot of land. The wealth of the world's billionaires grew by 2 trillion in 24. That's 3 times faster than in 2023. And we know they buy elections. They especially did this in 2024. And within 10 years, we expect 5 trillionaires. And I like what Abigail Disney said. Every billionaire who can't live on 999 million is some kind of a sociopath. While all of this is going on, 3.6 billion people, or 44% of the world's population, live under the poverty line of $6.85 per day. So inequality is getting worse. Now, Canadian farmers are price takers. They're trapped in the middle of a U-shaped power asymmetry between input companies on one hand and companies on the other hand that buy products. I just took my 3-year-old grandson to a farm show, and there were lots of tractors and skid steers and so on to climb around on. He loved it. But most equipment is dominated by 3 big companies. And then in the food processing sector, there are really only 2 in Canada that are processing beef, and very few that are processing pork and other things. And then, of course, in the food retail, that's also concentrated. Yet, farmers are apologists for the ag system. I find it really disturbing that some of the people that are farming today, they're my relatives who had Mennonite ancestors who had to escape Europe because of persecution, because they believed in pacifism and would not fight, came here, and yet they're apologists. There are neighbors who are descendants of the Scots who escaped the clearances, and they are now apologists for the ag system as it is. Some of the Irish farmers who escaped the potato famine are apologists for the ag system. Some of the Dutch who escaped Holland after World War II. And it seems to me that if we looked to our ancestors, they would be dismayed at how we support the control that the large companies have in agriculture. Now, going to feasting. About 100 years ago, Fritz Haber filed a patent for the synthesis of ammonia from its elements. And he was awarded a Nobel Prize. And the background to this is that in Germany, they saw the First World War coming. They used to rely on guano, bird poop, that they hauled in for nitrogen and phosphorus and so on. And he figured out how to take apart the N2 molecule with a triple bond, break it apart with lots of energy and pressure, tack on 3 hydrogens, ammonia, add 1 more, ammonia, yum, yum, yum. That's what plants like to eat. And he had ammonium nitrate or fertilizer for, but he was only doing that in a lab. His buddy Bosch took a few years to scale it up. And since then, we've had nitrogen fixation with very high energy input, especially natural gas, for high gas pressures at high temperatures in industrial end production. Today, about half the people in the world depend directly on the Haber-Bosch process for basic food. And N fertilizer is by far the biggest energy input into agriculture. Sometimes we talk about transportation of food around the world. That is energy intensive. We talk about big tractors and machines and so on. Yes, they're energy intensive. And fertilizer is by far the biggest global ag energy input. And I think it's really important when you look at papers that are assessing life cycle assessment, they're looking at where the energy is in agriculture. Sometimes they draw a boundary around the farm and they do not include the energy that goes into producing N fertilizer. Granted, that's before you get to the farm gate, but it's a huge part of energy in agriculture. I just want to mention World War II. At that time, there were as many people who died from starvation as from military deaths. The Nazi goal was Lebensraum, or that was to eliminate useless eaters. And a lot of the German prisoners of the Soviets died of starvation. This book by Lizzie Collingham, I highly recommend, The Taste of War. And it's driven our approach to agriculture, I think, in modern times, because in my opinion, we're still reacting to World War II and to the starvation that happened then. And there's this mentality in agriculture that we must feed the world and produce more and more. And if we're feasting, that seems to be evidence that there's not famine. Now, another Nobel Prize winner is Norm Borlaug, and he figured out how we could have more nitrogen go to the grain and not the stem of a crop. So if a crop of wheat is growing and you put on too much nitrogen, it tends to grow tall and then fall over, and it's very difficult to harvest. He figured out how to reallocate the nitrogen within the plant so that more of it went to the grain and the stems were stronger to hold up that grain. And it was this that was really the Green Revolution and made a huge difference in grain yield. After that, nitrogen fertilizer use increased. Fossil fuel energy in agriculture increased because that was the biggest input of agriculture going into nitrogen fertilizer. Grain yields increased and population increased. And I have a slide here by Bill Reese just showing the population increase. And you can map on N fertilizer, fossil fuel energy, or grain yields, at least from about 1900 on, and it maps perfectly onto this graph. The question is, which is the independent variable? A lot of my colleagues in agriculture will say, well, the population went up, so those of us in agriculture are on the side of the angels, and we figured out how to produce more and more grain to keep up. And other people might question whether that's the way it actually happened. Now, the goal of mainstream agriculture, as I said, is more and more to feed the world. We've got 8.2 billion people today. By 2050, possibly 9 to 10 billion. That's less than a 25% increase. However, I frequently hear from my friends that by 2050, we must increase food production by 70 to 100%, especially in developing countries, because their average incomes will rise and thus there will be more meat consumption and we have to grow more and more and more. Now, that's what I want to say about feasting and how we got there. But the failures of it are that we now have 1.4 billion cattle, almost a billion pigs, 24 billion chickens. They all require feed. But furthermore, and I think this is egregious, they're often fed food. They're fed crops that could be going to humans for direct consumption, but we want to get faster gain in chickens. We want to get more liters of milk per cow. And so we feed grain that is such high quality that some of it could be food. And they all release methane, of course. And from 2015 to 2021, we've had huge increases in meat production. So in my world, the way I look at this, the livestock tail is wagging the entire food system. Now, there's also a lot of waste, and my colleagues and I at the University of Guelph did an audit. This is a link to a paper that we did. And when you look at wasted food, it's important to look at what is unavoidable, apple cores, melon rinds. But I quickly asked the question, how big is your apple core? If it's a great big one, that's not all unavoidable. And then we have to look at what's avoidable. And with our students, we went through compost bins from the city of Guelph. They gave us permission to go through and sort through many of them. And we determined that 53% was avoidable. And there was 11% in the mushy middle that was possibly avoidable. And there was, in one case, there was half a summer sausage. And in my tradition, you never throw out summer sausage. And my students had to hold me down. Otherwise, I would have eaten it. There's $58 billion. That's the value of wasted food in Canada. And 46.5% of all food in Canada is wasted, according to this study in 2024. And there are still, even today, more people who suffer illnesses from overeating than those who suffer from not getting enough. And I think it's important also to note that we spend a lot of our time being so busy that we barely have time to eat a meal, and we often eat meals while doing something else. 2/3 of healthcare costs can now be attributed to chronic diseases associated with unhealthy eating. And this comes out of a study by CAPI, the Canadian Ag Policy Institute. They're not exactly flaming left-wingers. Now, the annual healthcare costs in Canada, according to Val Tarasuk at University of Toronto, are higher if there's marginal food insecurity in the home, and she defines marginal, moderate, and severe in her paper. If there's moderate food insecurity, the annual healthcare costs are 49% higher. And if there's severe food insecurity, the annual healthcare costs are 121% higher. And she makes the point, and I fully agree with her, that food insecurity, at least in North America and Europe, is caused by poverty. It's not because of lack of food. It's because of poverty. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that soil organic matter levels, SOM, soil organic matter levels, are decreasing on 82% of fields in Ontario. 54% of fields have an erosion risk that is too high. And only 20% of cropland has very high cover, that is covered over 300 days. When bare ground is pounded by rain, it erodes and loses soil organic matter. And the gospel, according to Martin, and all my students know this, is keep your soil covered. And we're not doing that by any means. Now, approaching famine or increasing the risk of killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. There was the Irish potato famine then and Sudan now. And famine is what it always has been, a failure of states, a logistics of policy. But it's also related to war. It's also related to poor management. And we've had it in the past, and we still have it today. And then we go to the planetary boundaries, and I know many of you in this group know about this. I just want to point out that in 2009, when Stefan and Rockstrom and the group came out with their first paper, at least the first one that I read about planetary boundaries, the two that were the most, that had crossed over beyond the planetary boundaries were biosphere integrity or diversity, and also phosphorus and nitrogen. And both of these can be related to agriculture. We went way beyond what we should in losing genetic diversity. And this meant that there was functional diversity. So their paper in 2009 and again in 2015, the chart looks very similar. And we're way over in terms of nitrogen going into the biosphere, and that we've only, as I said, been manufacturing nitrogen fertilizer since 1908. Well, and on a large scale since 1913. Phosphorus is mined mostly in Florida, Morocco, some in China, and there's some processing, adding acid and so on to make it more available. But there's way too much phosphorus in the biosphere as well. But then jumping up to 2023, the same group, and Richardson was the lead author in this paper, not only are we losing diversity, or we're way beyond in what we're losing in diversity and phosphorus and nitrogen, novel entities have become a real problem. And believe it or not, in agriculture, microplastic pollution is really causing a lot of problems. And one of these issues is slow release fertilizer. In order to get slow release fertilizer so that more of it becomes available to the plant, that's a good thing, we're coating it in plastics, and that happening every year is going into the soil and creating lots of microplastic pollution in the soil. Climate change in 2009 and 2015 by this group was deemed to have too much uncertainty to say whether or not they thought it had crossed the planetary boundary. Now there's no doubt. Land system change, and a lot of this is attributed to agriculture as well, is way beyond what it should be, cutting down way too many trees and losing biodiversity that way and natural habitats. And freshwater change. Green is water available to plants. Blue is water that's directly available for people to consume. Ocean acidification is very close to the planetary boundaries. So we're at 6, almost 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries that have been crossed. Now, photosynthesis is of course the basis of agriculture and our life on Earth. And net primary production is what is left over after the plants do their own respiration. What is appropriated by humans, so the human appropriation of net primary production was 10% pre-industrial, 15.7% in 1950, and now is more than doubled what it was pre-industrially. So humans are using way more than our share of net primary production. And then with climate, I'm sure most of you know these figures. 2024 was the warmest year, warmer than 2023. And the last 10 years have been the warmest on record. January was the warmest January we've ever had. And then Bill Reese's paper on Overshoot, he says it very directly. We are consuming and polluting the biophysical basis of our own existence. The global economy will inevitably contract and humanity will suffer a major population correction in this century. And there you see the curve again that he shows. And you'll recall that I said the nitrogen fertilizer, fossil fuel use in agriculture and grain production map right on to this curve. But grain production isn't going to be able to keep up, I can assure you. I wrote an article within the last year called The Collapse of Civilizations is Possible, and there's a link to that article here. Now, I want to look at a few potential solutions. The first thing I'd like to point out is that some students and I looked at the data in Ontario. This is where we felt most comfortable. I wanted it to be Canada-wide. At one point, I was ambitious enough to think that we could do it globally, but we decided to work with Ontario because I was more comfortable with the data that we had available to us. And our conclusion was that Ontario could use 40% less arable land by not growing grain dedicated to livestock. I have no problem with grain or with forages, like, clover, timothy, alfalfa, all the plants that are really good for the soil being used for livestock. I come from a Mennonite tradition where we were called clover farmers. We were also called religious heretics, but the worst condemnation was that we were clover farmers and we would make livestock and clover and forages work together. If we didn't use so much of our land in Ontario to grow grain for livestock, we could increase food production in Ontario by 40% while maintaining sufficient animal protein for an adequate diet. And that's according to the Canada Food Guide. Today in Ontario, we have over 2 million acres of number 2 yellow dent corn. That corn is exclusively for livestock feed or ethanol. It is not for human consumption. There is some other corn, sweet corn, and there's a little bit of white corn and so on that Indigenous groups are growing. But by far the majority of corn in Ontario is number 2 yellow dent, and that is not food. And a lot of people would argue that Canada has to keep producing corn and meat and so on for export markets. Dominic Barton had a big report to agriculture and talked about how Canadian agriculture has to export more and more. I tried to make the case to some of the major food companies in Canada that Canada may soon have markets for all the food crops we can grow, and we're not going to have to tie ourselves in knots to market and compete in markets today. It's rapidly coming to the situation where any food crops we can grow, we'll be able to sell. And I think we should conserve our farmland in ways that allow us to use as much of it as possible directly for food consumption. Now, here's a what-if scenario. This paper by Sufrit and Ramankutty argues that organic agricultural yields are about 25% lower on average than conventional. So what if conventional or mainstream agriculture produced high-quality food with yields that were 20 to 25% lower than now? And what if wasted food was less than 15% and not greater than 40% as it is now? In those cases, would we aspire to produce 25% more food so that we could waste 40%? I think not. Now, in reducing wasted food, 1 billion extra people could be fed if we just applied the best current methods that are available to us. No new technology, just applying what we know how to do. We could feed an extra billion people, or we could reduce production by that much. And the result of our going to all the compost bins and Guelph and sorting through food and looking at wasted food was that people with more food awareness waste less food. So whether it's because they have a person in the family with a special diet, they might be gardeners, whatever reason there is for them to have more food awareness, it's very clear that they waste less food. And one of the things that I think we have to look at is right now there's so much money going into the ag system to keep food prices low. As they rise, it's pretty clear that people waste less food. So I just want to come back to the point that it's really important to reduce poverty to improve food security. So yes, if food prices go up, that may have an impact, but there's no evidence that food charity is a solution. And Val Tarasuk at U of T has pointed out many times that really to respond to food insecurity, we need to do that through income-based interventions. I'm a great fan of a guaranteed annual income or a basic universal income, I think as Hugh Siegel calls it. And there are a number of papers that point to, and this would have advantages far beyond addressing food insecurity, but I think that is the way to approach it. So I would like to see the price of food rise to its real value so that people respect it and waste less, but then have guaranteed annual income programs to support people and keep them away from poverty. I just want to mention that farmers markets are wonderful. I had a conversation with a well-known international journalist a few years ago. I'll choose not to say who it is. And it was pointed out to me that, there was a farm in the family, and if things got really bad, they could always retreat to the farm. And and then he dropped the comment, well, how hard is it? And I said, farming is really hard. And if you don't know how to do it, and you're going to try and retreat to your farm in an emergency, not knowing what you're doing, that's going to be a big problem. So I highly recommend that you develop a relationship with a farmer, and this is why I'm such an advocate of farmers markets. And you don't have to go to a farmers market to have a relationship. I have a dentist, a doctor, and I have a farmer, Jeremy, and I buy a lot of things from Jeremy. And he's a type of guy that always sells things in $5 units. So in the summertime, he's got lots of kale. So I get a big bundle of kale for $5. In the wintertime, he's got less. I still pay $5, but I get what he's got. And I like the system. But if there's anything in between a $5 increment, he always rounds down. And I say, Jeremy, I want you to round up. I want you to stay in business. I want that relationship. And I've calculated that I can walk to his farm if things get really bad. Another hypothesis I have, and we tried to get funding to do this work. We tried it for 3 or 4 years, and then I retired. But the hypothesis is that it is cheaper to provide free Ontario fruits and vegetables for all low-income Ontario citizens than it is to continue paying their health costs if they continue with their current diet. And it's very evident, according to the literature, that when people are in poverty, they'll go for calories first, and they often neglect fruits and vegetables. But if they did have access to fruit and vegetables, particularly mothers with young children, would make sure that their children got them, and that would help prevent a lot of health costs. My friend Rod McRae, now retired from York University, wrote a wonderful paper a few years ago called A Joined Up Food Policy for Canada. One principle is he has 8 or 9, and I've only included 3 here. Everyone has enough healthy food and knowledge to optimize nutritional health. Some food system resources would be publicly owned as essential. And I referred to an article that came out recently, Is Canada Now at a C.D. Howe Movement? This was with reference to the Trump tariffs, but I think that when we look at food and food security, we might want to have some of those public crown corporations that C.D. Howe advocated during World War II. And food production, processing, and consumption are regionally appropriate, and food supply and quality are dependable. So those three are the ones that I've outlined here. If you have a chance to read Rod's paper, I encourage you to do so. I also want to talk about going to autonomous power units. On farms in general, tractors and equipment are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the main rationale is so that one operator can cover more land more quickly. The other rationale is that if you own a lot of land, in the spring when it's time to go, you want to have enough equipment capacity so that you can cover that land in the optimal time. I would like to suggest, and a few of my colleagues have said this too, that one operator could operate 10, 15, 20 small autonomous units with a cell phone. They might seed earlier drying land within a field with an earlier hybrid and leave wetter land for later. There might be small, low yield patches that they work around. And for small autonomous units in a field, you can have irregular borders that might facilitate natural habitat. You just program in the most optimal way to cover that field. And then an operator would not be riding each unit. They would be on the ground looking to make sure the seed is being planted properly or harvested properly or whatever is happening at the time. And I wrote an article about this called Smaller and Smarter, and you can read more about that if you're interested. I want to say something about soil organic matter levels. It varies according to soil texture. In sand, soil organic matter is good if it's anywhere between 2.1 to 3% soil organic matter. In clay loam or clay, it's good if it's 3.6 to 4.5%. So it depends on the texture. So my argument is that government should pay financial incentives to farmers who maintain the outcome, not the practice of no-till or something else that farmers have been paid for. They should be paid to maintain the outcome of good or very good soil organic matter or increasing soil organic matter levels in fields. And this would be voluntary every 5 years, according to a consistent scientific protocol. If they follow this voluntarily and they can show that their soil organic matters are good or very good, there would be a payment, and it would be commensurate with how good the soil organic matter is. There would be a mandatory soil organic matter measurement when the farm is sold. We often hear that farmers are cash poor and asset rich. Well, when the farm is sold, they do have some cash. And I think they should be paid according to how much the soil organic matter is, or they should be taxed according to how much it is below good. So if it's just a little bit below good, it's a small tax. If it's poor and way down, they get taxed a lot more, because arguably soil organic matter is a public good, and it does all kinds of things to assist in crop production. I think we should incentivize diversity. I think at least 3% of each farm should be reserved for natural habitat. There would be a higher incentive if it's more than that. Ways to improve natural habitat. Gospel, according to Martin, keep soil covered all year with service crops. Service crops are generally forage crops. Sometimes they're called cover crops, but they provide cover. They take up excess nutrients. They provide pollinator services. They provide habitat. And so my grad student and I call them service crops. I think we need to look at telling farmers that they have to have a certain proportion of their crops in short season varieties. There's a temptation as corn heat units get more and more every year that farmers want to have long season varieties to take advantage of all that heat. But I think we have to be prepared for the wonkiness of weather that will be coming. And Ontario has felt a bit isolated, and a lot of Ontario farmers don't believe in climate change because they confuse climate with weather. And so far, things have been pretty good. But I think we should have to plant some short season varieties, a proportion in every field. So we plant those early and we plant those late, and we have various harvest times. And I think it should be mandated to have a diversity of cash crops in each farm that are between forage crops or along with them to spread the risk. Just a comment about Ken Lang and his organic no-till potatoes. 10 years ago, I would have said that it's impossible to grow potatoes with no tillage. But Ken Lang has proved me wrong, and good for him. And there's an interesting report here about it. No-till has been advocated by a lot of people, but it usually assumes an obligate relationship to herbicides. In organic agriculture, of course, we don't use herbicides. So he's figured out that he can plant potatoes, and that's what he's done in one here in a cover crop. You can see the cover crop. He's planting potatoes right into it. In 2, he's checking the little potatoes and how high the cover crop is. In 3, he is mowing the cover crop just over top of the potato plants. And in 4, he is harvesting. There's no tillage in this system. It's organic, and he's getting yields that are not as good as conventional potato yields, but the market for that product is very good. A mention to the Canadian Food Grains Bank. They rebuild livelihoods after a crisis. They used to just go in and provide food, and now they're trying to change that so they go in and help communities respond. And the African Orphan Crops Consortium is a great example of how they look at food production in Africa in opposition to what Bill Gates is doing in Africa. Bill Gates is taking rice and maize and trying to increase the nutritional value of rice and maize because they've got high yields. In the African Orphan Crops Consortium, they have up to 100 orphan crops that are already rich in vitamins, minerals, and micronutrients, and they're trying to do research to make each of those crops yield just a little bit more. And I have a link here if you want to see more about their work. And then seed saving is so important, especially now as we go into uncertain weather conditions as a result of climate. And there's a wonderful story in The Guardian. Well, it's heartbreaking to read about how some of the people that were at the Vavilov Center in Leningrad during the siege of Leningrad could have eaten seeds to survive, and they chose not to in order to protect the seed collection. And at the same time in the US National Plan Germplasm System lost 10% of their workforce in Doge firings. And just one more thing, struvite. I think we have to figure out how to get nutrients from sewage. And there now is a really good process to extract struvite. It's a source of phosphorus from sewage, and you can apply that to crops, and it will probably meet the organic standards because the extraction process is very mild and benign. Now, what if solutions fail or they are not implemented? And I just want to say at this point that up until about 5 years ago, I've been working as hard as I can to try and encourage people to adopt solutions that I think will work. And I've come to the conclusion that either people are not interested and they don't want to adopt them, or some solutions have failed because we as humans haven't decided to really make them work. So this brings me to a book I read last year called Life After Doom by Brian McLaren. And I made a conscious decision in my life when I was quite young that I did not want to become a cynic and I did not want to become bitter. And regardless of what happens, I want to live in faith and hope and love. And in this book, he talks about 4 possible scenarios, and he argues that we can have hope in any of them. So the first is collapse avoidance. We transform civilization and live within ecological limits. He gives enough hints in the book. He pretends to be as neutral as possible about which of these scenarios will happen, but it's pretty clear. He thinks we've gone beyond collapse avoidance. Collapse rebirth would be where we collapse, civilization collapses in specific regions and surviving communities rebuild. Collapse survival in 3 would be collapse of civilizations with a tenuous future for just pockets of survivors. And then 4 would be collapse extinction. That'd be near or total extinction of humans and other living species. And I want to refer to Tom Berry, who was an eco-theologian. He argued that Earth is primary, human is derivative. And then there's also Wabagishi Rice, who wrote the book Moon of the Crusted Snow and Moon of the Turning Leaves. And he talks about a scenario where people in Northern Ontario, Anishinaabe, survive after a big collapse in Southern Ontario, and the grid goes down and all transportation is lost. And I think as I see things developing now in scenario 2 or 3, it will be the peasants, the ones that are farming 80% of the land now. And that may include my old order Mennonite relatives and Indigenous peoples that may inherit Earth in a scenario 2 or 3. In 4, our efforts may be just to persist for surviving, our efforts may persist for surviving species to help them carry on. Now, a couple quotes from the book. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live in defiance of all that is bad around us is itself a marvelous victory. And then he also says that there are 2 primary news stories. First is humanity's bumpy descent toward collapse and inevitability sooner or later for a civilization in overshoot. Second is the beauty unfolding in the world. Beauty abounds. I wrote an article recently called Faith, Hope, and Love, Even in the Worst Scenario, or Scenario 4. So the faith would be that humans are gifted beings in an interconnected universe of wonder and mystery with a right to be here. That's the faith. Not that we have faith that our civilization will survive. The hope is that some will develop deepening insights about our authentic selves and act accordingly as individuals and in communities and keep acting whatever the outcomes. Again, not to necessarily keep the civilizations that we have. Love sustained our ancestors to survive with meaning and offer potential for our lives. Love, exercised one day at a time, reveals our capacity to hold other people and all of creation with open palms for as long as we exist. And then I have great respect for Robin Wall Kimmerer. I think the book by McLaren, Life After Doom, is my favorite book of the 2020s. In the 2010s, I think Kimmerer's Braided Sweetgrass is the favorite book of that decade. And she says, even a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair, not because I have my head in the sand, but because joy is what the earth gives me daily, and I must return the gift. And then my last slide is that I think it's important to be thankful for healthy ecosystems and healthy food and appreciate enough for as long as we have it.
Well, thank you for that, Ralph. It's quite enlightening, and you know, I'm voting for figuring out a cultural style that enables us to stay within the planet's boundaries, and it involves being more involved in what we do with our lives rather than with you know, with what we do with stuff, with our technology. But that's another discussion. We're going to take questions for Ralph right now. I've a couple. Paul Beckwith is on deck. I have just one to ask. Well, Paul gets his camera in order and then turns on his microphone. I've heard that organic, you know, like local gardening can produce more food in an area than industrial farming. And that's attributed to the fact that it's got human energy focused and directed on the plants specifically. Do you have information on that relationship?
In my book, I talk, when I talk about energy in agriculture, I talk about endosomatic and exosomatic energy. The endosomatic is the bodied energy that humans and animals contribute. And traditionally, we've used a lot of endosomatic energy. And I think, I don't know, like it would depend on the region and how good the soil is and so on. There are some areas where you probably can produce, if you're just looking at volume of food or tons of food, you probably can produce a lot more with nitrogen fertilizer and big equipment. But it depends how many people would be there and how many people would be working. And if, I mean, I think 100 years ago, there were something like 25% of people in Canada were in agriculture. Now it's about 2%. So we've replaced endosomatic energy with exosomatic, and that's been the problem.
Okay, thank you. Art, you're on deck, and Paul, your question?
Yes, very interesting talk. Thank you. So I guess how revolutionary was the Haber-Bosch process at the time? Like, were there other people working on it that may have come up with it? Because it seems to me that, without that process, our global population would be much lower, half probably. And also with the Borlaug, improvement and stuff, how revolutionary was that? So, these people, we thought were doing the world a big favor, but it turns out we're suffering from climate change now to a much worse extent because of these processes, making it so much more efficient to grow food, letting population spike, etc. And the other question I have while I'm at it, because I'm outside, I don't know if the background noise is loud, I'm walking my dog. But the other question is about cover crops. So if, I didn't realize it was so bad to have bare soil exposed. I guess you lose, it dries out or you lose nutrients. Like why are cover crops an absolute necessity? Thanks.
Okay, well, let me start with the cover crops. I'm tempted to go on for hours here, but I'll keep it short. First of all, when you have cover crops, you reduce the raindrop impact on the soil. So if you have rain coming down in soil that's bare, the raindrop impact will move soil particles. And if there's a bit of a slope, you start losing your soil to erosion. And there are all kinds of models to figure this out, like depends on the grade of the slope and the intensity of the rain and so on. So that's one reason you want cover crops. And in most of Canada, the problem is in the shoulder seasons, like just in the fall after the cropping season and in the early spring. When it's covered by snow, we don't have to worry too much, but we sometimes get intense rains in the late fall and the early spring, and if there's bare ground, that soil will move. And then if the soil moves, it's often the soil organic matter in the soil that moves more than other parts of it, and then there's less infiltration in the summertime. So you want more soil organic matter, and you want cover will help the water to infiltrate into the soil, and it will hold it there, and then you're in better shape for the cropping season. I could go on, but it's really, really important to keep cover on soil. And that's why forages are so good. And that's why I support some animal agriculture, particularly ruminants, even though there's some methane emission. I think there are a number of papers that show that if you use forages judiciously, you will make up if you have a CO2 equivalence for what those forages incorporate into the soil, offsetting what the ruminants that are eating them will generate. Now, getting back to Fritz Haber, there's a biography. I can't remember the name of it. I don't think anyone else was working on this at the time. I think, as far as I understood, it was his individual genius that was working on this. It was driven by World War I, and he was funded in order to do the work because of that. They knew that the Brits had a better navy and they weren't going to be able to keep importing guano. So it was very revolutionary. And when Bosch scaled it up, I think it was beyond what they could have imagined. And and then it didn't really, like, it was in Germany within World War I. It didn't really take off until after World War II. And ammonium nitrate, of course, can also be used for bombs. And so it was, you know, during World War I and II. But it was after World War II with this real drive to improve food production to make sure we don't go back to the famines of World War II. And I think you're absolutely right. And that's why I said in the graph that, you know, which of these curves is the independent variable? Like my Aggie friends would argue that human population was taking off and we had to do something to help. But one could argue that by having nitrogen fertilizer and applying a lot of energy to produce it, and then grow more grain with Haber and Borlaug, we were just creating the conditions for more people.
Great, thank you.
You're muted. Mike, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. If anybody else has a question or a comment, please just make a note in the chat, and I'll acknowledge you after Art's comments or question. Art.
I have a comment on coverage as well, and it's kind of a two-part one. I really appreciated the planting of potatoes and with a crop on top, and that sort of R&D that's gone on and been quite successful with two crops. But I look at rows of corn, for example, and of course there's no crop in between these rows, and the earth is virtually bare. And is that a problem, or you're just talking about raindrops and soil erosion? But that's kind of part one. Part two is there's been a lot of activity going on in the Netherlands and other parts of the world where there's solar arrays that are raised, and there's crops growing underneath, and some of them there's sheep and other animals that graze there. And the things that I read say, well, the crops don't get as hot. They get enough sunlight, and if you select the crop right, and etc. The animals love it to be able to get into shade, and so it goes. So do you see a real future for solar arrays and agriculture complementing each other, and solving some of this crop coverage issue, or at least ground coverage issue at the same time?
Yes, let me do with the agrivoltaics first. As long as the panels are mounted on a post that's in the ground, and you can still grow vegetables or forage crops underneath. And I know of a case near Carleton Place. I know a farmer there who saw an installation of solar panels, and they were having problems mowing all the grass that was underneath the solar panels. And he said, look, if you allow me to bring my sheep in here, I can deal with all these forages, and I'll save you a lot of money. You won't have to have the mowers anymore. They didn't charge him anything for doing that. Some of the solar engineers complained about getting sheep shit on their boots, but other than that, everybody was happy. It was a win-win-win. And it worked really well. And the sheep actually preferred the panels because during the hot days, they did have shade. And there are cases of agrivoltaics with vegetables, and particularly those that need more shade. And I think there's lots of opportunity to do that and to work with that, provided that they're mounted on posts, not mounted in such a way that takes up too much land, so that you're using very little land for the mounting, and then you can grow something underneath. And then going back to what you said about corn rows, some of the more progressive farmers now, and I didn't take time to talk about this, but they have what they call biostrips. And one of my favorite farmers that I've been working with has his whole farm, in strips of forages, and he's working to find the right forage because he doesn't want forages to grow too high. He's not trying for growth like you usually do with forages. He wants forages that stay low and that do not go sideways, so that the corn rows are always maintained, the crop row. So one year he'll plant corn in the crop row, the next year soy, the next year sunflowers, the next year twin row wheat. But the biostrips, the forages, are permanent. They help to mop up excess nutrients. They help infiltration of water during the season. They prevent erosion. It's a very good way of managing it. It's trickier. It takes more time. It reduces herbicide options, which in my opinion is a good thing. And there are more and more farmers now that are working with biostrips or strip tillage, if you will.
Okay, and I have another one as well. By the way, that was very interesting. I like that. I am aware of so many families that have family customs, and there's religious groups and ethnic origin who have diets which they've grown up with and go back generations, and that includes what they do eat and what they don't in terms of food wastage, and as well as the size per serving, these sort of things, which are probably not all in line with your presentation here. How difficult is it to try and convince these customs ways of eating and types of food to change to something which is more healthy and perhaps less meat and other considerations for getting a balanced diet?
I'm not a social scientist, and I'm so perplexed by human behavior. I don't get it. But I would say that when we were working on the Wasted Food Project, I had a student who volunteered to do a project, and bless her soul, I had her go and look at all the religions and how the religions talked about wasted food. And every religion, whether it was Buddhism or Christianity, Muslim, Jew, all of them were against wasting food. And they all thought it was a travesty. Like there was some part of their religion that said it was a travesty. And they all admitted that during their feast times, there was too much wasted food. And they all admitted that that was something that they had to deal with. Like, and this was just according to literature. This was just a literature search, but they were all aware of the fact that some of their traditions, particularly their feast times, I think regular, day to day wasn't as much of a problem, and they could deal with not having wasted food, but it was their feast times where most of the food was wasted, and they all agreed they should address that.
Well, I guess that addresses part of my question. It's really in dealing with the social scientists, who are trying to persuade ethnic groups,
Yes.
and how much pasta, and you have an Italian background, how much pasta is, and how much meat is how do you go and encourage people to encourage eating more vegetables?
Yeah, well, like I said, I'm not a social scientist. I do know that our research pointed us to leftovers and attitudes toward leftovers. And if you have too much pasta or whatever, figure out how to use it in leftovers. And the households that wasted the least food were the most judicious with leftovers, and they had plans for using leftovers. And that again goes to the awareness part, that those who had the most food awareness wasted less, and often it was because they understood how to use leftovers.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Claude Butner has a comment. I just want to ask while he's getting ready. You used the word struvite?
Struvite.
Yes, what's that?
Struvite is like, it looks like a white pellet. It's just extracted phosphorus from sewage. And the link I have explains how it's done.
Okay,
In the
because that
slide.
sounds complex.
It's a fairly minor or a mild extraction process, and you can extract phosphorus from sewage and then apply it to crops. And it's not as common now as it should be, and it still doesn't compete very well with phosphorus prices of mined phosphorus. But if we were including all the ecological costs of mined phosphorus, it would be a very good way to do it.
I'll look for your link. Claude, you're on. Dave Doherty has something you can get on deck. Claude.
Okay, thank you very much, Ralph. A very interesting presentation. Actually, I'm going to ignore my earlier comment with just to complete, and that can be covered later on perhaps. But I actually have a question in there regarding Sir Dyson, who farms, I put 35,000, I see it's actually 36,000 acres in the UK. And I've seen articles, policy articles, that the UK cannot feed itself today. And so Dyson, with his expertise and his mind for inventing at the small scale, is experimenting with small electrically powered what I call cultivator machines. They're the size of a household appliance, but they do the task that normally would add to the cost in farming and be done by large tractors and complicated machinery. So he's thinking very differently out of the box. And yet, except for the Dyson channel, I don't see it anywhere else in newslet feeds or even on YouTube. Are you aware of this
Yes.
potential movement, and what can
You
you
can
tell us
look-
about it?
You can look for something called robots, ROW bots. They're little machines that go down rows, between rows of corn or rows of soybean, and some of them will pull them out like they cultivate. Some of them are very specific. They have sensors that can identify what are weeds, and they'll have a spot herbicide treatment to deal with whatever weed it is. But this is being developed. Different companies are looking at these various machines, and some of them are powered by solar panels, and they can keep going up and down rows. I think it's still fairly new, and there's a bit of a problem, like with mobility, and if the field is a bit too rough, some of these smaller units don't manage to get down the row without tumbling, and they have some design problems that they have to get over. The farmer that I mentioned that has the biostrips, there's now a machine that a company is developing that automatically goes through and mows those strips, so that there's not a tractor, there's not an operator. It does 4 strips at once, and it just goes down the row and mows and comes back and mows again in between, so that you don't have too much competition from the forage crop between the rows. But there are a number of companies working on that. So yeah, robots, ROW bots is the one that I remember. If I had a little bit more time, I could probably come up with a few others.
Well, that'll get us started, and I put it in the chat already for those people who run across this on YouTube. Thank you,
Okay.
Ralph.
Okay.
Dave Doherty put a link to the Stovites, so if anybody wants to find that, they can find that in the chat. And Dave, you've got a question for Ralph.
Thanks, Mike. Just before I go to that, production of struvite is what we would call tertiary treatment in sewage. You might have heard it before. It's been going on for several decades in most of the major Canadian cities. Not everybody does it. Here's my question. And in a way, it's related to what Claude was just saying about being able to feed yourself in Britain, or the country being able to feed itself. You're likely aware of the so-called Century Initiative, which calls for 100 million people in Canada by the end of the century. Assuming we are unable to import food later this century, there are all kinds of reasons why that might be the case. What sorts of diets would we be able to provide for such a population using domestic food production methods?
Well, I wouldn't advocate going to 100 million, but and I would go with the approach of the Canadian Food Grains Bank of trying to work with people wherever they are to help them produce food where they are. But assuming that we had 100 million people in Canada, we would need a lot more vegetable production. And there's lots of land in Ontario that we could use for growing vegetables, more potato production, more lentils, dry beans. Those are all the crops that I think we should be growing. Peas, all the crops that provide protein and vitamins and calories. And we've got the land that we can use. And I don't want to rule out greenhouses. Like, we have a lot of greenhouse production in Ontario down in the Leamington area. Most of that is exported to the US, and most of it's used to grow cucumbers, tomatoes, and peppers. But there are other things you can grow in greenhouses. My farmer, Jeremy, grows kale. He grows beets. I've had beets for the last 3 weeks from his greenhouse, and he's always rotating crops within his greenhouse, and he's got a big land base. He has pigs that eat all the vegetables that can't be consumed by humans. And if everybody farmed like Jeremy, there'd probably be plenty of food.
You think we'd have trouble with what has in effect been our building model up to this point in time? Something in excess of 90% of the Class 1 agricultural land in Canada is underneath Toronto.
Yeah. Well, that's, for sure. Like, we have to preserve the farmland we have. There's no way that should go under pavement. We've done way too much of that already. And I think in BC, like, they've got the Agricultural Reserve Act or whatever it is, but people are fiddling with that and building monster homes on, and then they have 2 acres of blueberries and qualify as farmers. And there's things going on that just, it's pretty obvious that has to stop. We have to keep all the land we can for agriculture. But at the same time, with agricultural land, I think and I didn't mention agroforestry, but there's a lot of room for growing crops between rows of trees. And there was Andy Gordon here at the University of Guelph had some fascinating research how you could grow, even though you take out about 7% of the land for the stumps or the trunks of trees, you still have yields that are pretty much the same because of the shade they provide, and with the leaves and the nutrient cycling and the water cycling. There's so much we could do with agroforestry that we haven't even touched yet. And then that gets into permaculture, and there are lots of opportunities there as well. And so that goes back to what Mike was saying we need more people who are willing to do physical work, and we need more endosomatic energy input and less exosomatic. And that's an attitude. Like, and a lot of people feel that farm labor is beneath them and nobody wants to do it. But if we shifted our attitude about that, there's a lot that could be done.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, I see Ted on the screen here. Have you got a question, Ted, or are you?
I got both questions and a comment. I'm going to agree with what everybody has said, but Ralph is quite right. It takes social science as well as the physical approaches that he has been doing. I did it for a long time too. I was head of the Lands Directorate Planning Program for Canada for a long time, and we actually created the work modeling areas to be set aside as land reserves in BC, supporting and setting up the stuff in other parts, including helping Ontario try to get it right for a while. The real issue is people do not necessarily look holistically at people's relationships with the farms and other lands they live on. They don't look at them holistically. And certainly a lot of people think it's that we don't have the ability to support 100,000. We may or may not, but what is really the question is the lifestyles we wish. Dave has heard me say this, counter him before, on saying that essentially that there are 300 million people living in the same size as in parts of China on an area the size of Manitoba, and they're able to eat adequately. So it's really a function of numbers, of lifestyles, of what they're prepared to eat. Yeah, if I want caviar and steak every night, it ain't going to produce 100 million people here. So coming back to this, what can we do to optimize? I'm not saying maximize, but optimize the way in which we use the farmland that we do have available. Do you have a model that might work?
Well, first thing is to use it for food as much as possible and not for feed. Like, and as I mentioned in Ontario, we could have 40% more land for food if we just stopped growing grain that was dedicated to livestock. And I think that's true around the world. So much of farmland, and especially in the Amazon and all that land, that's the trees that are being cut down, a lot of it is to grow crops to feed livestock, and that's where I think we can make the biggest jump. We also can make a big jump with not allowing food crops to be fed to livestock. And I know there's a bit of it's going to be hard to manage consistently year by year, because some years you might have a lot of crop damage and the crops would not meet human specs. And then another year, all the crops would be suitable for people. So you'd have to have enough of a base to keep your chickens and pigs going for the years when, but we're not thinking that way now. So first is to use land for food crops. Next is to make sure that any food crops we have go for food. And then I think thirdly would be, we've got to address wasted food. And I call it wasted food rather than food waste, because I think the noun should be food. And the
a lot of other
descriptor is
countries don't treat it as waste. They are somewhat more conservative of what they actually produce. Even so, the waste, of course, is immense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Claude Butner had another comment, and Art has a question after that. So Claude?
Actually, that's why I called it note-taking. I wanted to make sure to capture what Ralph was suggesting for future use. So that is not a comment.
Okay, so Art.
Yeah, I grew up in Thunder Bay, and in those days, everybody had a home garden. And growing vegetables was just part of living. This is what you did. And we see some of that possibly still surviving with garden plots and what have you for in cities. I know Ottawa has had a program for some time doing that. But are you aware of any movement or any group that is trying to encourage these garden plots or growing more food at home?
Most of the groups like that are doing that are local, in local areas, and but yes, I think about the Victory Gardens during the Second World War, and I know that when I was a kid, everybody had a garden, and I think it's really important that we go back to that. And part of that came out of during the Depression, people wouldn't waste anything, and they had to grow a lot of food themselves, and then there was an attitude toward respecting that, and then food became cheap, and I think it's because of the policies after the Second World War to make sure that we feed the world and we never have famines again, and the government support policies for agriculture to produce so much, and it was essentially energy going into food production. And then people were dissuaded from their gardens because it didn't make economic sense. It was cheaper to buy it than it was to grow it themselves. But if we let food rise to its real value, then I think a lot more people would garden.
Yeah, and a related question, I recently heard of someone who was advised to put iron particles on their lawn, because instead of weed and feed or any other of these chemicals you can get at your local hardware store. Because that was good for the soil organic matter. Do you find any truth in that? What is the role of iron?
That really depends on the soil type and texture. I'd want to see the data. I don't know.
Okay.
It's not common.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Speaking of data, is there any trends that you've seen about foreign ownership of our farmland and what that means for our overall food security?
Yeah, I mean, there was some concern in Saskatchewan a number of years ago that there was concern that too many numbered companies owned by Chinese were buying farmland in Saskatchewan. I think the Saskatchewan government has taken steps to address that. I like the legislation they have in PEI. Nobody can own more than 1,000 acres. And even the Irvings have not been able to get around that one. They've tried, but as far as I know, they haven't been able to get around it. And in Ontario, I'm not sure, but as far as I know, most land is being sold to other farmers. And some of those farms are corporations, even though they're family managed corporations. But I also know examples of family owned farm corporations who are splitting it up because they decided it was too big to manage and they were doing more management than farming and they wanted to have the opportunity to farm again. And so they've split it up a little bit. That was particularly happening in Manitoba, as far as I know. But I don't have the data at my fingertips for that.
Okay, well, that's the list of questions. If anybody else has got something about a question, oh, Ted, yes.
Yeah, one comment. Many years ago, we had reports of Europeans coming in and stealing our farmland in Ontario. And we actually were commissioned to underdo a fairly detailed analysis at Environment Canada, the Lands Directorate. We traced it down, and there were less than 50 people involved. But the problem was every time a Dutchman went through your community, 50 people reported them. And suddenly we had thousands of people coming in to steal our farmland. The answer is there are half a dozen sales of family farms, people migrating to Canada, but it has been it has not really been an issue anywhere else in Canada. PEI is correct. You have very good standards in place. We worked with them back then, getting them put in, mainly focused on small farms, but primarily on coastal zones, because they wanted to keep people migrating in from outside the province to take over their coastal zone, their coastal areas. And that was also been fairly successful. The only difference is the government stepped in with money. They would not ban people from buying it, or they would ban somebody buying it who wasn't based in province and actually put their money forward to take it over. That's why they have a lot of good coastal parks. Ain't easy.
Okay, well, that uses up our list of questions and comments. It's been awesome, Ralph. Thank you very much. And I do have another thought that I've heard a lot about the function of fungus of mycorrhizal and their relationship with garden plants in particular. But is that a factor in large scale agriculture as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, my PhD was in growing intercropping corn and soybean, and we were looking at the mycorrhizal benefits of mycorrhizal associating with corn and soybean both help to get more phosphorus out of the soil. We thought that there might be a way for the nitrogen from the soybean to be transferred to the corn, but it's not a direct transfer. The nitrogen is sloughed off in the nodules and the roots of the soybean, and then some mycorrhiza associated with the corn that help pick it up. But it's much more effective at picking up that sloughed off nitrogen if the corn has a positive mycorrhizal association. So we did that work in greenhouses as well as in the field, and I'm a consummate intercropper. I just love talking about intercropping, and that was one of the reasons that it was working really well, was because of the mycorrhiza. And again, it works much better if you have fewer pesticides and herbicides, because sometimes the herbicides interfere with the mycorrhiza.
I've heard that the fungus do better over winters if they have live roots to be associated with, or are they able to just
Yes,
sort of,
that would be, I think that would be true, yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
but they do okay if they have nothing to connect with?
Well, sometimes in fields, that's a big problem, like with there's a lot of tillage and so on, and then to get the mycorrhiza revived again. And then, you know, they've been talking about inoculating with mycorrhiza, and that doesn't work very well. It's much better to keep live roots in the field as hosts for the mycorrhiza.
Thank you for that. Yes. So our in slide is ready, and I guess Ted is ready to be our official thank you.
Okay, yes, happy to do that, Ralph. We very much like having people coming on telling us how we actually can do things better, and sometimes we even listen, and we try in fact to to try and in fact affect the politicians to show them that there are positive ways where they can make a difference, and that is never easy, of course. And I can see. I mentioned in my thing, I worked with Barry Smith. You may know him when he was at Guelph. And he and I were doing modeling for Canada together with IASA and other people, just essentially to try and figure out whether we could affect the way in which Canada sustained its environment and what elements were vital to do so. And the good news is that some people did listen, but as you noted yourself, they are starting to pick away at it. We're getting freeways through the farm belt, and BC is finding reasons to sell small properties for people to do fruits and berries, and then putting a house to take 30% of it that they can then live in with their extended family. So yeah, it is never easy. That said, we need people desperately working on trying to find positive solutions that do work. So I'd like to thank you very much for coming on. Thank you very much for helping us keep this series going on trying to get Canadians to understand what is useful, necessary, and maybe even to find ways to do it. So I would again ask those of you who have not yet joined the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, please join us. Time to pay your dues if you haven't. And if you are aware of other people who wish to join us in these conversations every week, we're on over 240 of them now, and they hopefully are making a difference. So once again, thank you very much to come on. And we will be putting all of them as we do on YouTube. And please feel free to share them and to get other people involved in trying to save the planet. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And if you go